Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for asking me to speak today. I am a practicing lawyer here in Kamloops, as Belginder has explained. I've been doing this job coming up on 20 years in May, and 12 of those have been in Kamloops in the interior. And this last 3 years, has sure been a challenge in terms of all of the disasters that the interior has faced, but as well, we've definitely seen the effects in other parts of the province, all the way north, all the way in each direction, and all the way down to the island. As I understand, most of the attendees here today are support workers in the community, which is really what keeps this province going through all of these disasters. And us lawyers, we often don't see the day-to-day effects of what's been going on because we are brought in generally later to deal with when the process fails, where it hasn't gone well for the community programs or the people who are utilizing them. And so what us lawyers tend to get the reputation of being bad news bears, because we're usually the ones who have to tell people that what they thought was going to happen isn't going to happen, or it's going to be more difficult, more expensive, or simply can't be done at all. But we also get the privilege from time to time, not as often as I'd like, of dealing with insurance companies, government assistance programs, and being successful, sometimes wildly successful, and that feels really, really good. So we don't get as often that feel-good response of having those successes as you all must because most of the time the programs do work the way they're supposed to, and you help a lot of people. I'm just noticing that someone is saying that the sound is cutting in and out. Is that me that's cutting in and out, Sarah?
Is anybody else experiencing that issue? Okay. Okay, it looks like just
okay.
a bit.
And you were hearing it fine, Sarah?
I hear it. I don't hear it cutting in and out. It's not. Oh, I guess it is. Oh, it's scratchy. Yeah, I do hear it scratchy, but not cutting in and out. As in, I can still hear every word clearly. But if that's not the case for folks here, put it into the chat and let us know.
Okay, well, so Sarah's voice is clear, but is mine clear? Interesting. I don't know how we can resolve that. I can try it with the microphone again.
Sure, we can try that again. I have the benefit, unfortunately, everybody, of having done a lot of these webinars on the back end. So I've troubleshooted my mic situation.
So how is it with the external microphone? Is that any better?
All right, let's go with that.
Great. Just let me know. Sarah, maybe just come off mute and yell at me if you can.
Sure.
So the first part that I want to talk about is, oh, good, okay. Is the barriers, risks, and the types of losses that we've been seeing across this province when it comes to a disaster. So first of all, what defines a disaster in this province? Well, there's actually a legal definition for disaster that triggers government response involving the intervention. And it means that it must involve a minimum of 10 homes and affect a minimum of 25 people in order to qualify as an actual disaster, provincially speaking. So this makes sense because the deployment of mass community resources is really only efficient, economical, and effective. It's designed to target a group of people for a specific purpose. When we refer to disasters, they're almost always unexpected environmental events that cause damage. In British Columbia, just in the past 5 years, and we've probably, lots of us have blocked a lot of what's gone on, but we've endured several disasters, some seasonal and seemingly some of them on repeat. Wildfires, floods, landslides, severe sustained summer heat, and also severe sustained winter freezing and snowfall, avalanches, of course, the pandemic, and we've also sustained disasters with pest blight, like the pine beetle, and cattle illness, like mad cow. And so some of these disasters have actually triggered other disasters. For example, the floods caused large land mass erosions, landslides, and the loss of animal herds. There's also been severe weather causing crop loss and loss of animal herds. Wildfires cause wild animal encroaching into towns and cities, which causes a different problem there. And then the many evacuations. There's been evacuations that are now causing vacant homes that are vulnerable to theft and vandalism. And then there's evacuations that are causing strain on supportive services and increasing the vulnerability of our community and crime. Now, we've not yet experienced, but it remains a threat constantly, things like tsunamis and pest blights for crops and earthquakes. Those are all potentials in British Columbia. And then just the other day on the news, they were talking about how the volcano in Washington State might be something that we need to worry about, because that will cause problems in the Lower Mainland. So as you can see, the importance of having a community outreach system and a legal perspective on what happens during these disasters is so important, because there's just more than we can even enumerate. The number one problem that almost all people affected by disasters have identified is communication barriers. And that's why all of the outreach and support workers in the community are so valuable, because they and all of you are often the first contact when someone is experiencing the effects of the disaster. So there's personal physical barriers to communication that exist. For example, if English is your second language, if you have deafness or a speech impairment, if you're elderly or frail, or if you have a disability, those are all physical barriers that can cause problems. But there's also practical barriers to communication. Electricity has been cut off in regions of disaster. So how would a person charge their phone or laptop to access information or resources? If they have no access as well to TV or radio, if there's no electricity, they can't get updates. And then secondly, internet and cellular service has become paramount because of displacement in rural areas. That leaves little access to this. But even in cities, because a large volume of people will often move to the cities during a time of disaster, and that overloads the system. And in addition to communication barriers, a person facing a disaster will often have difficulty accessing ways of meeting their physical health requirements. Medication is often lost, forgotten, or destroyed. Regular attendance at doctor's offices, physiotherapies, or fitness facilities would be a really difficult task in the middle of disasters. Pets are usually a source of comfort and joy for many of us, but in times of disaster, they can be a barrier. Accessing shelter and finding food to appropriately care for those pets can be problematic. Displacement and relocation from a person's usual place of shelter comes with a real host of barriers and risks. Safety, always a concern, both personal and for a person's valuables to their personal life. And a relocation may not be long-term, and that instability is often difficult to manage. Finding alternate accommodation that's appropriate and accessible is a challenge. If you have children, pets, or mobility issues, or any special needs, that becomes more problematic when there's limited accommodation available in a disaster, because all of your neighbors are going through the same thing and also having the same needs as you. Tent cities, community emergency shelters such as rinks, churches, school gyms, or even hotels have issues with safety and security, and even such issues as appropriateness. Imagine having an infant or a toddler in a room or bed next to a person with a dog that barks, or younger adults who stay up later and might be boisterous. Even without any intention of any malice, these situations are hardly ideal or appropriate. Now, in the interior, this situation has come up for evacuees a number of times in 2021, over and over for even the same communities. Full communities have been evacuated over and over as first wildfires and then floods threatened or happened. And so many people with usually stable residential situations found themselves without shelter and with limited options. People who've lived in their homes for 25 years were leaving with an hour's notice, even less time than that in situations like Lytton and Kelowna, where lightning strikes and grass fires flared up in minutes. So even with a plan, no one is really prepared. I'm going to use myself as an example. I live in Kamloops, and I was myself evacuated on July 1st. There was a lightning strike that started on a hillside block from my home. And I have to say, I was not thinking about important paperwork or logical items to take with me and my family at that point. I was thinking about my pets, my sentimental items, and what I was going to do with me and my family over a short period of time, like 48 hours. So you're always thinking immediacy, not practicality in the long run. And as a funny now, but not unusual example, I think I'm an adult and I am fairly responsible and I'm usually very organized. But in that circumstance, I was hurried. I did not have a solid plan in place and I had a million priorities at once going through my mind. It happened in the evening, so it became dark. I was worried about losing things in the scramble. So I put any jewelry that had some sentimentality or value on myself as I was packing up some clothes. I didn't want to throw it in the bag. I was putting it in because in the dark, who knows where that would end up. And I was loading up pet food and I was loading up the vehicles with my kids and my pets and my mom, and my husband. We actually couldn't find our cat, so that felt really upsetting. And so we helped our neighbors who were older load their car, and then we joined this really long line of cars driving down the one road into my neighborhood. And we're driving through the fire, past the trees that were on fire, and they were going up as we were driving by them. So we weren't in any immediate danger in our vehicles, so I wasn't scared, but very overwhelmed. And that's the very common occurrence. And so I show up at my brother's house and he took one look at me wearing my necklaces and rings and bracelets and asked me why I had on my Mr. T starter kit. I really needed that laugh because we spent the night listening to the local radio and watching Facebook posts and waiting to find out if we had a home to go home to. The communication was patchy, evacuation gets lifted and then it was on again. Communication was terrible and no one in that community slept. So what I learned from that and what I think is important for everybody to learn from any of these experiences is what would have burned up for me that night if the wind had turned west instead of north, which was the only thing that saved my neighborhood that night. My passport, my birth certificate, home contents that were insured, but maybe not, depending on if my home burned or if it just had smoke or heat damage. We would have had our vehicles and a weekend's worth of clothes, and that was it. So this is where the multitude of steps to rebuild come in and where all the practical, legal, and financial issues start to arise. So let's start with a poll. Sarah, if you put up the first poll? Where does everyone, I just want one answer for the top thing. Where do most people store their important documents? Where do you yourselves store them? Bank, lawyer's vault, personal vault, personal filing cabinet, blocks in the deep freeze, or under your mattress?
Kerri, I think you see the participants as they come in. The participants don't. We're at about 70%. And I can run it for another 5 seconds and close it and share the poll results after. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, ending the poll. And I'll share the results. Oh, Kerri, we lost your audio. No.
Now.
Okay, you're back.
Okay, and is it scratchy again?
Yes.
Okay.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. My goodness. So most people, it sounds like, store their important documents in banks, personal vaults, and then personal filing cabinets. So all of these are viable options, although I wouldn't recommend the mattress, fires and floods. Older gentleman client of mine told me about the Ziplocs and the deep freeze, and that's a really good one in a pinch. If you're leaving the house in an emergency and you have to leave things behind. Deep freezes usually withstand fire and flood, but the food may rot or melt. But if it's important papers or IDs or jewelry and they're zipped up in the Ziploc bag or container, they'll still be there when you get back. And if the food's rotting, no looter is likely to look in there either. So that was, I thought, a really outside the box suggestion. I noticed that nobody keep their documents in the lawyer's vaults. And I would personally suggest that for any estate planning documents you have, as opposed to your home vault or a bank, because unlike a bank, you usually have a long relationship with the lawyer and there's no change in policy or employees like a bank would have. So accessing your documents is really simple. Also, once a lawyer has identified you for the purpose of preparing the documents when you first retain them, they have copies of your ID in the file, and now they know you. And so if you lose your ID in a disaster, you can still be identified by your lawyer to allow you accessing your paperwork, and they can probably give you a notarized copy of your ID that they have on the file to use to obtain new ID. And that's a big concern for a lot of people in a fire or a flood or any kind of emergency, is losing ID. So in the event of a large-scale municipal and community loss, this is Lytton or Merritt, where the town community services were also lost, the usual supports aren't available. There's no alternative place to shelter, like a community center, a church, or a rink, because they're also affected. And banks and businesses and city facilities are affected too. And so the necessities of life are all impacted, and every struggle is going to be felt through every sector. And so one of the big things that everybody is trying to figure out is how to get alternative services such as water, sewer, garbage, power, natural gas, vehicle fuel, and then the emergency and alternate housing. And fire, medical, and police are probably going to be very tied up. And so let's just go to a second poll. Number 2, in your experience, what is the majority that use community services in times of disaster? Number 1 group that uses them.
I think this one is a harder question.
It is. It is. All right. Should we end the poll then?
Sure, yeah, I'll share the results. Oh, some last minute trickles. All right, so end the poll now, I'll share the results.
Most of the categories are off, and that's very true that just about everybody is using community services in time of disaster, but it changes and varies depending on the disaster. But every single one of these groups in a disaster will need to access community services, and they're also going to require some legal, financial, or support assistance in a time of disaster. But it may be that each of you in your respective roles come across individuals and groups from each of these sectors will need guidance, advice, and assistance. And we'll get into what those are next. So one thing that crosses every demographic, region, and disaster is that the impact the disasters have on all of our mental health and wellness. Disasters are stressful, they make us angry, they dealing with the getting emergency assistance or dealing with having to just navigate all of the changes causes a lot of frustration. People come together where usually they have their own individual houses, and proximity can cause a lot of mental health and wellness strain. Accessing medication, feeling stable and feeling safe are all causes of mental health problems. I'm so thankful we live in a time where this is actually recognized, and identifying it or holding it up to the light is now a good thing, not a bad thing. Because not everyone is resilient, not everyone has resources. And even if you do some or most of the time, being confronted with a disaster can change that in a minute. And there's no shame or even a surprise in that. It ought to be expected. And I believe it actually is now, because supports are beginning to be preemptively available and accessible. I was so pleasantly surprised when I was on the government website and noticed that there were all of these free links for mental health and well-being. That just makes all of the difference if people can access those, so long as they can access the technology that gets them to that. So moving on to part 2 is the legal issues and considerations that we all need to figure out when we're navigating this with people who are dealing with a disaster. One of the main issues that lawyers are consulted about following a disaster is assistance with difficulties surrounding identification and documents that have been lost or inaccessible in a disaster. Because the main items we can't navigate this world without is, think about your wallet, all the documents in there, your bank card, your driver's license. As well, there's your passport and birth certificate, your social insurance card, and then your legal documents. For example, court orders for guardianship, powers of attorney that might be needed immediately. Those documents need to be accessed. And so how do we go about replacing those items if we don't have identification to prove who we are, to even, you need ID to get your ID. So there's a number of ways of proving your identity. For example, when you first retain a lawyer, we take a copy of your identification and we usually retain a copy in our file. Banks are the same, and so are social services. So if a person already has an existing relationship with social services, a bank, or a lawyer, which I would think takes care of the majority of the population who have a really existing relationship with one of those three, it may be as simple as just obtaining a copy of that ID on file and then having a certified copy made by a lawyer or notary and using that to get the rest of your ID. So once you have a notarized copy of your document, you can take that to ICBC or Service Canada. Now, if you don't have an ID or a relationship, that's where lawyers really come into play. You can attend with a lawyer, and a lawyer can have you swear an affidavit that can be used for various government agencies. That can be really important for when a situation like Lytton or Merritt, where you can't access the property anymore and everything that's in it was destroyed. The lawyer is able to use alternate means of identifying you to accomplish this. So we have special rules that allow us to identify people for purposes of obtaining their identification. And it's for unique circumstances, as in times of disaster. For example, I have had recently a matter where a person came in with a destroyed ID, but the client had a long and had no relationship with me as a lawyer. They had a long-standing Facebook page and had photos of her that were time-stamped and comments made over the years identifying her, that I was able to satisfy myself as to her identity when comparing those photos and the person attending in my office, along with the timestamps. Some photos from 10 years prior. That would be a pretty long standing scam to get somebody's ID to have to have done that for all of those years. She also sent it to her brother, who did have identification, and he attested her identity and swore an affidavit as well. It's difficulty in a situation where the pending financial transaction, that was just a matter of getting new ID that is destroyed in a disaster. If there's pending financial transaction.
Kerri, I think your audio is cutting out again.
How is that now? Is it
I can hear you.
Okay,
It's scratchy, but it's consistent. How is that for everybody?
that's really too bad. I'm so sorry. I've
Let's
moved the
go with it.
microphone. Okay, I've moved
Let's
the
go with it.
microphone closer. So if there's a financial transaction, for example, a person's showing up in my office selling a house but had no ID, that's a pretty big red flag that something fraudulent is going on. And so that's a different situation than simply aiding someone to get lost or destroyed identification back. Another legal scenario that arises and is so disheartening for everyone involved is when someone passes in a disaster. Identification of the remains is sometimes an issue. And if a person is missing in the course of that disaster, such as a wildfire or a landslide or a flood, there is a legal process that needs to happen to have the person declared dead so that their estate can be properly managed and dealt with. And that is a very sensitive issue, but one that really only lawyers can assist with. The application process is pretty overwhelming and very difficult to navigate, even for those of us who do paperwork all day for a job. And so I can't imagine having to do that when you're also displaced or dealing with death or a loved one missing. And if they're not missing and there are remains in a disaster, it can still pose issues as to how and when to deal with those. For example, in a pandemic, funeral services are limited. And if the will is lost or cannot be accessed, the funeral home doesn't have any authority to deal with the body if we know a will exists, as they will not be able to determine who is appointed as the executor in circumstances. And so it's important to know that the appointed executor has the sole discretion to direct what is done with remains. So it may be that the deceased remains have to remain with the morgue while that's sorted out. And in some cases, it's a non-issue. There's a spouse or adult children that can agree on what needs to be done. But if there's any sign of a disagreement or a responsible person can't be identified or located, it all has to wait. This is where having a will stored with your lawyer can solve this. A lawyer can release the will to the funeral home directly for that purpose, or they can advise the funeral home as to the name of the executor listed in the will. And this is where estate plans become so important. And they should be encouraged no matter how much or little a person's estate is comprised of. I hear this all the time. Well, I have a very simple estate, it's all going to my spouse, and then if not, my kids. That's fine if everything goes according to plan, but nothing ever does. And if anything, these disasters have shown us that. What if one of your children predeceases you, but they leave children of their own? What if you and your husband or wife go at the same time? There's legal ramifications for every single event that can occur. And the one thing that every single person has in their estate is their person, their remains. And someone needs authority to deal with that. And so the main estate planning document that everybody knows about is the will, the last will and testament. In a disaster, a will can be easily misplaced, damaged, or destroyed. Wills are the most important thing after you pass, but I would argue that the power of attorney is the most important thing to have for emergency situations. But the nice thing about wills and powers of attorney and representation agreements, the three main estate documents that you need, is that they don't necessarily need a lawyer if it has to be done in an emergency, a hurry, or a pinch. There is a government link to some document precedents that can be used and that can be witnessed by two other people. Will, it's pretty specific. It has to be typed. It can't be handwritten. We don't have holographic wills in British Columbia. Holographic means handwritten. Not what I thought before I went to law school, that it was a hologram of some sort. And each page of the will has to be initialed by the two witnesses and the will maker. And then the last page has to be signed by all three. And the people who witness it can't be anyone who is going to benefit from the will, or it actually cancels out their gift. And so, for example, I couldn't witness my mom's will if I was going to inherit anything from her. Those are the important things to know if we are having wills drafted outside of a lawyer's office or a notary's office. I never recommend it other than in situations where there is an emergency or where truly the only thing in their estate is their remains and they just want somebody to be able to deal with that. The other two key documents everyone should have, or a version of these documents, is the power of attorney and the representation agreement. Now, I would argue the power of attorney is the most important out of all of your estate planning documents, because the alternative to a will, there's an intestate process that can happen. It does delay things, cost more, but it can happen. Similarly, with a representation agreement, if it's not in place, usually the medical teams are able to figure something out. But if you don't have a power of attorney, then no one can deal with your banking information, your land, anything of that nature. And as a result, a comiteeship has to happen. And that's where you have to go to court and have someone appointed and have the person declared incompetent of managing their affairs. 2 doctors have to testify to that. Cost and the time to have that organized in the thousands of dollars, generally about $10,000 for a commutation application. Power of attorney is a couple $100. And so in terms of bang for your buck, it is the most practical and affordable. As well, it is the least onerous. Once you have a comiteeship in place, you are tied at the hip to the public guardian and trustee for the entirety of the existence of that comiteeship order. You have to report every year. It's a lot. And the public guardian and trustee pays fees for that. If you have a power of attorney, the person who's appointed you as the attorney has shown that they trust you. And so you really report only to them in terms of how you've handled their finances, unless there is a concern that's raised as to the propriety of your actions. In a disaster, a power of attorney can really come in handy if a person is displaced, and especially if they're elderly or frail and they need someone else to handle their basic finances, their paperwork, or other financial or legal matters while they're displaced. A very, very handy document. The representation agreement is for your healthcare and for your care needs. So power of attorneys are for legal and financial only, and a representation agreement is mostly for care, other than you can add in some small powers for dealing with day-to-day finances. And so a representation agreement is actually an agreement or a contract with the person that you're appointing that allows them to deal with medical care professionals on your behalf or help you do that. So this is different from a care plan, an advanced healthcare directive, or a DNR, non-resuscitate order. Those are what guide your representative from the decisions that they have to make on your behalf, but the representation agreement is the actual authority to do it. And the reason we want a representation agreement in place is that healthcare advances change constantly. And so the last thing you want to do is lock something down, like do not resuscitate, let's say, now when you're young, and only to find out that 20 years from now when you need it, it's completely different. So what a representation agreement does is it allows you to appoint somebody to make decisions at the exact time that they're required, so that you can actually go with the newest science or the most innovative of the treatments that can be provided to you. And so that is really important. It also gives the representative authority to prohibit or allow people to reside with you, because as we know, elder abuse can happen in a variety of circumstances. And so having a representative who is there to guard somebody when they're at their most vulnerable is really important. And so I really recommend getting representation agreements, particularly when there's only one spouse left of the two, or if you've got adult children that may disagree. The last thing you want is to have your two children show up and one say, do one thing for your healthcare and one to say something else, and you're stuck in limbo because the doctor can't do anything because of the disagreement. Better to appoint the person who you think is going to do what you've asked them to do. In a disaster, the representation agreement is essential. If you have a situation where care is required or a person needs a representative to assist or make decisions for them for their health and well-being. For example, you can't rely on the fact that you live in a small town like Lytton, because in an emergency, you're not going to be in that town. You're going to be brought to a major healthcare center, or you're not going to know the local nurses and doctors. I hear from people all the time, well, I live in this nice small town and I know everybody and my niece is the local nurse. That is great and that's wonderful, and I hope that works out, but what if it doesn't? A representation agreement is really good.
Kerri, your voice is cutting out again. Sorry.
How is that?
Is that better?
It's a lot better. Yeah.
I think I need to unplug it and plug it in once in a while. It was the olden days, I guess, again, like we used to do that with our TVs. So the representation agreement as well can be filed in advance with your doctor or with your local healthcare center. So for example, if you live in a small community, I always use the Interior as an example because that's where I reside. But of course, I know that there are people tuning in from all over the province, and I'm sure it's similar in your rural communities, that there's a hub health center. And so certainly those representation agreements and powers of attorney can be registered with the hospital, the main hospital, so that there's not a scramble when you get there as to who has authority to help you in a situation where you need assistance with making decisions or making decisions for you. And you don't need a lawyer for your will or your representation agreement, those two specifically. And your power of attorney does not need a lawyer's witnessing if it's not going to deal with property that involves the land title office. The land title office is very, very sticky, and they require that a lawyer witness a power of attorney if it's going to be used to convey property. The alternate signing requirements, if you go under BC government's website and look under incapacity planning, there's all of the forms and templates there. And so there's also one other thing that often involves lawyers, but it's not necessarily required, is the process of probate. And that term is often confusing and not properly understood or explained. So you'll pardon me, but I always like to, any chance that I get, let everybody know what the difference is between administering an estate and probate, because those are two different things in most circumstances. Estate assets are only assets that are held in the name of the deceased solely on their own. So if there's a house held jointly between two people, that's not an estate asset. That is an asset that will pass to the surviving person who is survived and lives in the house or on the title. That isn't an estate asset that would be dealt with by a will or would be administered through an estate administration process. Similarly with jointly held bank accounts or any insurance or investments that you have named beneficiary. None of those are estate assets. They were the deceased assets, but they do then become the assets of the person who is the beneficiary or the jointly held person. So a will would not apply in any of those circumstances. And that's great estate planning, because the last thing you want have to go through a separate, extensive court process to deal with assets when you can simply give them to the other person who share them with. Probate is actually just, all it is a court application that is made to the local courthouse that either attaches the will or explains why there is, or that there is no will, but you're the most responsible person to administer the estate on behalf of the deceased person and give it to the people who are legally entitled to that. So if under the will, it's those people, or if they've died without a will, it's the people who are listed in the legislation as it goes. Usually it's spouse first, then kids, or if there's no spouse, kids, parents, siblings, there's like a full process that you can go through. probate process in British Columbia is 1.4% of the estate. You can imagine most people's houses are worth $500,000 or more in British Columbia. That can add up fast. And so that's why people have them held jointly. But there's lots of situations where you can't. And then that's when the probate process occurs. Most people hire lawyers to deal with the probate process if that's required. So if there's land or bank accounts that are held solely in the deceased's name, and then that part goes through the court probate process. Otherwise, if it's just stuff, things, personal effects, then those can just be usually distributed amongst loved ones without any muster fuss, and no probate is required. Usually when the first of two spouses passes, then there's just the estate or the assets pass, but the probate is required when just maybe one of the spouses is left or you're unmarried. In a disaster, the estate administration process is even harder to navigate. Us as lawyers, we've been dealing with this during the pandemic, and state probate applications with the courts usually last 3 months. Now they're lasting upwards of a year. And it's because, just like every other thing in this world, people are working from home, people are homesick, people are taking care of family. And so there's just not as many bodies working. And the logistics of getting things from one office to another, that sort of thing, is all just slowed right down. And so it's important to keep that in mind when dealing with disasters, is that everything takes longer, including after someone passes away. There's one caveat to what I've discussed here, and that's if a person holds property on reserve or on Crown land, then that estate planning process is different in terms of only the will. And there has to be a special will that is created for reserve or Crown property. There's only certain people can inherit. And so that as well is definitely something that you'd want a lawyer or notary to be advising you on. So in a disaster, the biggest issue that arises that absolutely requires the assistance of lawyers is insurance. So let's do our next poll, please. And that is, in your experience, who are the largest percent of people out insurance? Let's see what everyone's experience is.
Sure, I can close it.
All right. And so you're absolutely right. The homeowners, tenants, and farms are, and then recreational vehicles actually are often the people who are the percentage of groups without insurance. So,
oh, your audio's out.
Plug and replay.
Good.
good. So in disasters, there's special circumstances that can actually tie up insurance for each of these groups of insured persons. Because insurance companies will use any loophole in a disaster to minimize their payouts and maximize profit. I hear one more time that insurance companies would bankrupt if they had to pay out for all the claims on a whole community of claims. I'll scream. They won't. They will not go bankrupt. They assess risk, and they have insured products on all sorts of different circumstances. So if they're paying out in the Fraser Valley for cattle loss or building rebuilds, they're still collecting insurance on RVs, houses and businesses in other communities, and many other things. So if I leave you with nothing else today, don't feel sorry for insurance companies. They're going to be fine. This trope is just their way of making people feel better about having their insurance claim denied. And insurance companies will use any tiny excuse to do just that. Keep in mind that every mortgage requires the homeowner to have and maintain home insurance. So that's likely 90% of homes in BC, given the cost of housing in BC at this time. Very few people own their own home outright. However, there are certainly homeowners who have modest homes that they have owned for years, and so they have let their insurance lapse as the cost didn't feel worth it. That happened actually in Barrier when the wildfires went through their community in 2003. Many older homes with families that have lived in them for decades were uninsured. They had to rely on the government insurance funding, and that took years. That being said, it's really important to make sure the insurance policy contains the coverage needed in an emergency. It has to say things like overland flood or earthquake, wildfire, fire following an earthquake, live out allowances, loss of revenue, content replacements, voluntary medical payments, and then declarations of emergency. Those are the areas to look at when dealing with that. Voluntary medical payments is actually a really, really useful tool during times of emergency because every homeowner policy has it, and it's usually between $5,000 and $10,000. And if it's somebody's injured and has a medical expense while dealing with the property, so for example, they get burned in the fire or twist their ankle in the flood or that sort of thing, they can receive that voluntary medical payment from the insurance company, even if there's an exclusion on other things. That's one thing when you're advising people in the community who've been injured as a result of an emergency or disaster. If it's on property that's insured, they usually can get that voluntary medical payment, and that can help out because that gets paid out quickly. So the one thing that everyone needs to look at is the section that has the exclusions to see what qualifies as the act of nature, or they used to call it the act of God. I think they've changed that terminology now, but certainly act of nature. Because if you have to leave your home vacant, you're not in an area that has an official state of emergency declared, you're actually not likely insured if the house is left vacant for more than 2 weeks. As well, common for rising groundwater or water to be excluded. So sewer backups for emergencies like storm drain plugging often happens in a flood or during that freezing and thawing that we get in the spring. My policy that was renewed since all of these disasters now has an exclusions list longer than what's included. It's easier for me to tell you what's included in my policy than excluded. The list is shorter. They now exclude lightning, falling objects, which when trees are burning, they're falling. If the neighbor house burns from lightning, and that causes your home to have some melting or smoke damage, that's often excluded because it wasn't your fire, it was their fire. Windstorms, hail, and ice damming are all routinely excluded. So if someone has a loss that they've purchased insurance for, the first thing they have to do is visit the broker. But in an area where there's an emergency or a disaster declared, there's only a really short amount of time to apply for the government assistance. The insurer ends up denying it. So it's absolutely paramount to take the emergency form that provided by the government to your insurance broker at the exact same time you go in to notify them about your own losses. And the reason why is because the insurance broker has a portion of the form for the government application to complete, and that application needs to be with government within 3 months of the disaster. For example, right now in BC, the flood loss application deadline from the October floods is March 2nd of 2022. So people only have 1 more month before they're cut off from making an application for that disaster relief. We have, it was sent around earlier today, but I think Sarah's also sharing it, is the disaster funding relief, disaster financial assistance applications. And so one of them is called the homeowner insurance template, and that's the one that has to be taken to the insurance company and submitted along with the application. Now, the Emergency BC is dealing with all of that. If a homeowner, business owner, charity, or farm owner waits until they hear back from their insurer, keeping in mind that there's hundreds of people applying, they may not actually even get the denial from the insurance company in time to then turn around and apply for the government aid. And so that's why it should be done concurrently. There is capital loss relief through this disaster relief, the DFA, and it kicks in if you have an uninsured capital loss. So people fall into this trap. I helped a lot of people about 10 years ago when High River, the waters came up, because they all applied for their insurance. They all got denied, and it was all too late to apply for the emergency benefit with the government. And so then we had to go as a group and get them to extend the deadline. It was a huge hassle, and it caused a lot of people a lot of stress and anxiety. Emergency BC is in charge of this. They declare the eligibility dates and the geographic locations eligible. So in that case, it was Emergency Alberta. Emergency BC will actually notify the local governments, post on their website, and they'll publish information in the local paper. They'll also attend community meetings if requested to do so. And that's important for all of you who are working in community support, is to get those Emergency BC people to the community meetings. They are a wealth of knowledge, and they will attend if requested. And they have all of the ins and outs, because the rules change every single disaster, and I'm happy to report getting easier to navigate. And that's sadly because we've had so many disasters in the province, but it's fantastic that the supports are there. The support is actually 80% after the first 1,000, which is guest deductible, and then the cap is $300,000. So the deadline is a 90-day deadline for applications once the emergency is declared. And Emergency Management BC has a map on their website that shows the eligibility dates and the geographic location. Home eligibility is that it has to be the homeowner's primary residence, or there is a tenant using it as their primary residence. It has to be their primary home, and a residential tenancy agreement has to be in place. For businesses, it must be a small business owner with a revenue of less than $1 million and less than 50 employees. And if it's a farm, it has to have that farm deemed agriculture under BC assessment, and it has to be their full-time occupation or income source. Charitable organizations are, for the first time, these last few disasters, utilizing this emergency benefit. They have to be registered under the Societies Act, in good standing, and be in existence for 12 months. And then municipalities actually also qualify for this assistance, and they don't have a maximum $300,000. But for everyone, it has to be an uninsured loss and no other program coverage available. There has arose, and we can assure people that municipalities are now used to this. There's been instances where once a disaster happens, the houses have been in existence so long, they've been grandfathered with the old rules, and that land is unusable anymore for their home. High River is a great example. All of the homes along the river are no longer allowed to be built upon, but people own those lands. And so the municipalities have actually negotiated a land swap with the homeowners, where they're given a park, and then their old property that's on the river becomes park. So they've swapped, and the negotiation for that and the paperwork involves a lot of legal negotiation and contract work. And so that's something that absolutely a lawyer would need to be involved with. Exclusions for the benefits are that only necessities are covered. So your gym equipment is gone. It's not going to be replaced under the emergency benefits. It's only for the repair or restoration of the essential living areas. So that's kitchen. If there's, it's not your spare rooms either. So it's just the main rooms that you use. And then if it's a business or a farm, reestablishing a viable business or an essential infrastructure if it's a municipality. So recreational and seasonal properties aren't covered, and recreational items and landscaping is not covered. Tenants need not despair. If it's a tenanted property, the landlord is the one who makes the application, and they still have to apply as a small business owner, which makes sense. So they're going to apply. They're not going to use the homeowner program document. They're going to use the homeowner tenant one, and then they still have to get the insurance template. They're applying as a small business. Land lost is also not covered. The most recent example is Spence's Bridge and Merritt. Many of my clients used to have large tracts of land around their home, and now it's a river. And so they're not going to get any compensation for the land that's swept away with the river. Unfortunately, there may be some deals going on with local municipalities, local crown land or band land for property access. Again, those contracts will need to be negotiated. They're complicated, they're this thick. And so it's really important to direct those people to have legal advice, because usually people aren't dealing with government contracts on their own. So that's something there. The other thing is, to be uninsured, you have to have not declined any insurance that would have covered the loss. So it's always best to take the risks, all risks on your insurance policies, even if you think you won't need them. For example, an earthquake in Kamloops, because if something like that happens, then you're going to want to be able to access the disaster relief. If anyone's interested, the two legislation documents are the Emergency Program Act and the Compensation and Disaster Regulations that are applying here. The other thing that I've been seeing personally in the law office here is the assessments for 2022. Because if land or buildings were lost or swept away, which has happened in a lot of our community, the BC assessments were actually determining values based on what the property looked like in October of last year. So the current damage is not being reflected. So if the improvements, so the home or any structures have been affected, that application can be made now to vary the assessment. And I've shared those application intake forms. And the loss has to be 25% of the value of only the improvement portion on the BC assessment, or if it's uninhabitable or unusable for its intended purpose, business. If you've lost land or portions of your land, that actually has to stay the same for 2021, and they can't apply for reassessment. Thank you. Hopefully we're back. Okay. That has to happen with the 2022 assessment if you've lost land. One thing that was really heartening to see, thank you very much, Sarah, is AgriService BC. They have actually also added additional support for livestock relocation. And the other one that I really liked was they're providing mental wellness support for farmers. I grew up on a farm and a ranch in Saskatchewan, and every single farmer that I know would do anything for their animals. And so they're very, very, very upset with what's gone on with all of the losses and being unable to care for those animals like they want to. And so that mental wellness support is a big, big thing. Pharmacies as well are offering emergency medication for anyone who's been displaced or has lost their medication due to a disaster. If you're looking for documents to be replaced, unfortunately, there's no one single location. It's a complete travel trip for everyone. You have to go to Service BC, ICBC, Front Counter BC, and Vital Statistics for the various documents you need to replace. The other thing that was really heartening for me to see on the government websites was mental health. There was a 3-page list of links for free or low-cost counseling. I love that. I think that every single person who's been involved in these disasters has not gone unscathed. There's some sort of PTSD or anxiety or fear or depression, especially dealing with the pandemic, being in the house all the time with only yourself for safety. And so accessing all of those is phenomenal, and the list keeps growing every single day that I look. There's a longer list of free and low cost counseling in British Columbia. The SPCA has some great supports for pets. They can take on pets for a short period of time or help relocate them during fires, floods, and things like that. My family, when there was fires in another community outside of Kamloops Creek, we took some of the pets from there's a dog training facility that trains therapy pets. And so they were very lovely to have in our home. We really enjoyed that. And it actually gave my own puppies some manners. So that was a great added benefit for that. And the last thing that I want to note about the BC government website, I don't always think that their websites are helpful or navigating ease, but I did notice that they do offer services in all languages and that they have apps to be accessed as well, including if you want to access services. If you're deaf, you can dial 711, and then there's that government availability as well. The one thing I want to point out is that when you're negotiating contracts with governments and agencies, many landowners are working with the government right now, set up sites, public works in their community, material transfer stations, service depots, cleanup locations, blasting on their property to get material to stop the rivers changing course and the damage that's caused, or to assist in the cleanup efforts and build the roads, road access on Crown, band, or municipal land. An expertise of a lawyer is essential to negotiate and sign those contracts. A lot of people thought or think that they, oh, well, it makes sense to me that the contractor that came to talk to me about signing this contract explained it to me. That contractor also doesn't necessarily know the ins and outs of the government contract that was written by the person in Victoria. And so it really is important to have a lawyer go over it, because legalese times, and some of the language that's used is pretty complicated. We're going to go on to the next poll. In your experience, lawyers, what are they good for? So let's take a look. As you can see, absolutely nothing. That's, I don't know if anyone remembers that song. It was War, not Lawyers, but good Motown song. Well, I'm heartened that absolutely nobody thought that we were good for absolutely nothing. Thank you. And yes, we can help with every single one of these types of things. Often people well, they'll tell me that they're intimidated to come and talk to a lawyer or ask for legal assistance. They say, oh, it was just a small problem, didn't want to bother you. Or they think that we're very expensive. While lawyers do charge by the hour, that's not always true. Sometimes it's a flat rate, and it can be much less expensive than having to fix it later. It can be much more expensive. I always use the example of people who incorporate their own companies. Not often done correctly, and then they come to me to fix it and end up costing, because of all of my work and the filing fees, 3 times as much to fix the $500 they saved by doing it themselves. So just as but as well as lawyers, notaries are perfectly capable of dealing with any documents that don't require legal advice. So they can prepare wills, powers of attorney, representations agreements. Those are all very valid, and you'll get great advice from them, as well as land transfer documents, buying and selling houses. But what's important to know with a notary is if something goes sideways on those, then that has to get over to the lawyer, because notaries can't provide legal advice. And so that's one benefit that hiring a lawyer over a notary would be, although that most transactions are very straightforward, and so that's not an issue. The other thing that's important to note is that lawyers and notaries cost the same. Everybody thinks that notaries are less expensive, and that hasn't been our experience in British Columbia. There's also legal clinics. For example, the law students in Victoria, Vancouver, and Kamloops have legal clinics where they provide legal advice and services at a discount rate or for free. And of course, at the courthouse, there is all sorts of lawyers that are working with legal aid and are providing legal advice and services on a one-time basis. And then, of course, outreach programs and support services agencies are able to help with lots and lots of the documents we've been talking about. What the majority of people, I think, would be surprised to realize is that literally everyone thinks they have a plan for a disaster, but no one does, because the mechanism of loss can't be predicted. You can't predict a tsunami, you can't predict a landslide. So you have to be ready yourself. Communicating with family and close persons, photographing your contents of your home. After this last bout of fires and floods, I've recommended that everybody go through, just with your cell phone, taking pictures inside of your drawers, inside of your closets, and all around your yard and in your outbuildings, because you're going to need that if you have to deal with insurance. Have a plan for your pets. Have a radio with a battery. This, every every person said they wish that they would have had that, because if you don't have your vehicle handy, then how do you access radio if the power is out? And you have to be able to listen to updates, because that is the #1 news source in any community when it comes to a disaster. And then as well, there's keeping a small supply of cash on hand for just emergency essentials and for the short-term out-of-pocket costs. And the lessons we've learned from evacuations is having your vehicle fueled if you know that there's a storm coming, and prepare a go bag. And the lessons learned from floods, having waterproof containers and high ground. For example, a lot of people have just been putting their photo albums in those big containers of tubs and then just having that on their upper floors. Keeping your floor drains clear and having backup power and pumps available if you're rural. And then as well, having an emergency kit in your home and any hygiene and protective wear. Sewers back up in almost all emergencies. And the last thing you want is to have that concern. And because if you have any scratches or anything and then you're in unhygienic water, that's bad for your house. So having, rubber boots, gloves, those sorts of things. In your home, having food for 3 days or more. And then realizing that you actually have some supplies of water in your home. For example, if you have a water tank, that's how many liters of water that you can access. There's a little knob at the bottom of your water tank where you can dispense that water if you need it. And the back of the toilet tank too also contains water. So in an emergency, that water is clean and drinkable out of your water tank and your toilet tank. Not the bowl, the back tank. And then the lessons we've learned from the threats of disaster for evacuation alerts specifically is that key is...
You're losing audio again, Kerri.
Thank you.
The lessons learned from the threat of disaster in communities is community support, communication, being prepared, and protecting your mental health. That seems to, if nothing else, if you can protect your mental health, then you are already one step ahead of everything else, because being calm in a disaster is usually what is the difference between when you're packing to leave. I've heard people have all sorts of funny things that they've noted. They've packed a remote control, for example, but not a TV or whatever the remote control was for. And then the best place to seek support and assistance in a disaster, you can roll that poll 5. Best place to seek support and assistance.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Kerri, we lost you.
It's so disappointing.
Is it okay now?
Yes.
All of these places are great supports, and as well, lawyers, notaries, and banks can be a great assistance. Your banker generally knows you or has your information on file. When you're dealing with the cleanup, the last thing I wanted to touch on is the DFA is requiring that you have the some logs. And so in the actual application that they have, there's a section at the end, and that is where you can log your cleanup hours, the names of the people, the dates, the locations of what cleanup you've done, because that is reimbursable. And as well, they want you to take photos of the damage prior to cleanup, because they can't always get their people out there quick enough. The other thing that I've learned through these last disasters is the Red Cross is such a valuable resource for people in the province that are dealing with disasters. For example, the Red Cross will provide emergency cash of $2,000 for a one-time only to help get things sorted out for people who just need a little bit of help right away. And that's in conjunction with the province. I believe the Red Cross donates half and the provincial government donates half. But the Red Cross is always the one that their location states in the disaster areas and provides all the cots and blankets and cleanup kits for the communities. And they provide crisis lines. And so those are just the most important and valuable things. And then for giving tips to people who've been involved in disasters or displaced, can actually get their bills canceled for a period of time. But it's important to call and do that. So power, so BC Hydro, Fortis Gas, cell service companies, insurance companies, the municipalities for your property taxes and your mortgages will all suspend your payments or will waive them in some circumstances if you call and let them know that you're in one of those disaster zones. And so that can become really important when you're in a cash crunch because you're dealing with a million other things that you're having to pay for during an emergency. And then the last pool is is everyone's experience with average timeline for homeowners to be reimbursed from insurance or government agencies for their capital losses. What has been everybody's experience out in the community dealing with that?
I'll close it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
It looks like 1 year seems to be the sweet spot, and in my experience,
Kerri, I think we need you to, maybe it's every time I launch a poll or something, but
That's what it seems to be every time there's a poll.
interesting. All right, now we know. So yes, the 3 months I think is the immediate relief that the Red Cross is providing, and the Salvation Army too, actually. And then the government agencies for a rebuild, it just depends on how big the disaster is. The more homes that they have to get to, the longer it takes. And so 2 years is not unreasonable in a large community loss like Merritt or Lytton or Fraser Valley, but in a smaller community loss, like a wildfire or something like that for a small community, then you usually is the timelines are much quicker. And then finally is the registration lists. I know that the Red Cross and the Salvation Army both have registrations for when people are involved in those emergencies. I highly recommend that people who are involved in an emergency register themselves and say where they're staying. There's a lot of people that a lot of times could have been avoided had they done that because they knew they were safe, but no one else did. And so the, government and police and emergency and trying to locate them when they were actually fine. And so having people just check in and say that they're safe and where they are, it makes a huge difference with registration. And so those were my comments for everybody. And I think a couple of questions I saw. So I'm happy to answer those. If Baljinder, if you want to read those to me.
Yes, we have 2 questions.
Okay.
The first one is, if a will is lost, is it true that a copy is not legal?
That is correct, for administration purposes. So for example, if there's a copy, then you wouldn't be able to just do a normal probate process. What it is, a court, you'd have to make it a court application and the court would have to consider whether that copy reflected what the will maker was intending as their last will, because often copies are simply old copies and then the new ones somewhere else. And so the court's always reticent to use copy as the last will and testament in consideration, but it's not a lock that would help.
We lost you, Kerri.
Oh, go ahead with the next question.
Does government recognize power of attorney made by notary public?
Yes, a notary and a lawyer can both do a power of attorney that can be used by the landowner. Those are the only 2 groups. I shouldn't have said lawyers, it's lawyers.
The third question is, yeah.
Go ahead.
Third question is, do homeless or people who do not own land have access to any funds, might have been on crown land, etc.?
If they're on Crown or Indigenous land, then there is different assistance that is provided, and it's usually provided through the band groups. But I'm not aware of there being any restriction for people who are homeless in, for example, downtown Kamloops. I didn't understand there to be a restriction as to having to be a homeowner in order to access that. I think you simply have to be displaced.
There's another question. Can a document prepared in BC notarized in California following California's legal rules?
Usually, a will certainly will, but I always recommend that you update your documents in the province you reside. Because if you have assets in California and you have assets in British Columbia, then the disposition rules may be differently. And so you're going to want to do one will for each set of assets. But if it's, let's say it's your remains, let's say you're from California, you have a California will, but you've now moved to British Columbia, but you still have your California will appointing, your favorite cousin as your executor. That person is still your executor and in charge of your estate, even though you live in BC now.
The next question is, if one of the jointly holding persons passes away, does it then become an estate asset?
No, that excludes it as an estate asset. It just becomes the asset of the joint surviving tenant. If a property is held as tenants in common, though, where each party owns a percentage, so let's say I bought a property with my best friend and we each own 50%, then when I pass, that does become an estate asset because I own 50% solely, not as a joint asset.
I think that's about it for now. If anybody have any questions, you can raise your hand and ask directly from Kerri. She is here for a couple more minutes.
Ginger, I saw you shared with me earlier some other sessions were coming up. Here it is again to everybody.
Yeah, I sent it to you with mistake, but I did share it with everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are lots of sessions coming up. Please sign in to those sessions. And I also like to say that wills and estates is kind of a very popular session. People want to learn a lot. We have a session coming up on wills and estates, and we will bring Kerri back for sure, as she has such a wealth of knowledge to learn more about wills and estates in a time of disaster. I've really learned a lot from your session, and I'm really hoping that everyone have learned a lot from your session today. And if you have any questions anytime, please feel free either to send it to Kerri or myself. I can always forward it to her. And again, I am really thankful to her for sharing a wonderful wealth of knowledge with all of us. And thank you to all the participants for attending this session today. Yeah, thank you, Kerri.
Thanks, Belginder. You have a wonderful day, you guys.
Yeah, thank you. You too. Enjoy some sunshine.
Yeah, a little bit. Okay, bye-bye.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye.